Hello, everyone. We're very happy to have Dean Yang today for our Polycon UK webinar. This is the last one for this academic year, and we'll start again in the next academic year. And next week, we also have the annual workshop at University of Cambridge. Yeah, that's it. That's it. And thanks a lot, Dean, for accepting our invitation. Floor is
Of
yours.
course. All right, thank you. Let me just share my screen first, get everything squared away here. Okay, so can you guys see this okay? All
Yes.
right. All right, very good. Well, uh, very happy to be here. Thank you again for the invitation. So this is joint work with three stellar PhD students, Resuf, who's at Lausanne, Paul at Michigan, and Akhila, who's at Stanford. Look out for them all in the job market. In fact, this fall, Resuf and Akhila will be on the market. They're amazing. You should look at them carefully. Paul will be on the market too, but probably in a couple of years. And in addition, Alessandro Saia at Bologna is one of our co-authors. So to start off, I'd like everyone to think about where you all were in 1987. If you were in India at the time, you know what I'm talking about here. Large swaths of the country came to a standstill every Sunday morning in 1987, and the reason for that was a TV show called Ramayana, which was a TV serialization of the ancient Hindu epic, the 2,500-year-old Hindu epic, the Ramayana. The show is widely acknowledged to have really, as the headline here says, brought many parts of India to a standstill on Sunday mornings during that time. And there's a lot of documentation of that in the literature and in the news media. Streets looked like they were under curfew. There was no one on the streets starting at 9:30 on Sunday mornings. You couldn't schedule anything else to conflict with Ramayana on Sunday mornings. You had to delay your weddings and even your funerals. And if you were an employer, you had to be ready for rampant absenteeism. Up to 50% of hotel and restaurant workers and hospital workers wouldn't show up during the showing of the show. So I think I didn't grow up in India at this time, but those everyone I've talked to who was in India at this time, particularly in the major cities where there was good TV reception, it knows what I'm talking about here. These were the intensity of the reaction to the show was quite unintended. The show was commissioned and aired under the secular Congress government, mainly to raise advertising revenue. The show led to a substantial religious response by wide swaths of the viewership. Many people, it's widely documented that many people viewed watching the show as a sacred ritual. Viewers would ritually bathe in advance of watching the show. They would adorn their TVs with flowers and smeared their TVs with sandalwood paste, which are sort of markers of religious observance in Hinduism. In addition, it was widely remarked that the fact that there weren't very many TVs in India at the time, TV sets, led to widespread watching in a communal or group setting, which may have enhanced the communal and perhaps the religious elements of the experience. I wanted to, this is, this paper, I guess you can view as one example of, economics venturing into other realms of study, in particular, where, I think we're sort of unembarrassedly treading on, the work of, I shouldn't say treading on, building on, the work of cultural scholars and sort of media scholars outside of economics, who have noted many of the different elements that we're emphasizing in this paper. And what, of course, we're bringing is an economist's way of thinking about the phenomena, and, of course, frontier econometric techniques. But I wanted to share with you at the outset, what media and cultural scholars outside of economics have said about this show, and just sort of painting with a very broad brush. Scholars in media and cultural studies first of all, have emphasized the idea that the show initiated a period where it was more acceptable to signal and talk about one's Hindu identity. Prior to the show, reflecting the broad orientation of the Congress government that had been in power for decades since independence, there was, there had very, from a political standpoint, there had always been an emphasis on emphasizing pan-religious, cross-cultural, cross-ethnic personal, social identification, identifying with the Indian nation as a whole rather than one's particular religion. And many commentators have said that sort of the beginning of this show in '87 initiated a period where it was more acceptable to express one's religious identity, in particular one's Hindu identity. Um, Another sort of widely remarked phenomenon was the sort of the basic idea that because this was a television show, it was mass media on a single the only TV channel that was available in India at the time. This was an unusual, perhaps unique occurrence in which a huge share of South Asia's population was united in a single activity, hearing a single message instantaneously on a regular basis over the course of a 1.5 year period. And finally, it's been widely documented in sort of by political observers and cultural studies scholars that the show helped promote and led to increases in membership, for example, in organizations like the Bajrang Dal, the Hindu Nationalist Militant Organization. There's one quote that the TV series was a great gift to our movement in that it inspired many young recruits. And of course, there's been widespread commentary that perhaps the show played a role in the rise of the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party. So broadly, we're going to be building on this prior work of cultural studies scholars and media scholars with our sort of bringing our economist lens to understanding the impact of the program. So what we'll be asking in this show is, first of all, can religious mass media reshape identity? And secondly, what are the social and political impacts when one strengthens religious identity in society? Let me say a brief word about the identification strategy, since what we are bringing to the table is sort of frontier econometric techniques. We'll be taking a difference in difference approach. And as in any difference in difference strategy, we have two differences or two sources of variation that we'll be using for causal identification. The first is cross-sectional variation in TV signal in 1987. So we're going to be taking TV access or TV signal quality in 1987 as the measure of exposure to this treatment, in a sense. Thinking about the exposure or access to the television show as a treatment, we'll be measuring that by the quality of your TV signal in your location at the beginning of 1987 when the show started airing. Purely from a cross-sectional standpoint, one can already, I think, make a plausible argument for the exogeneity of one's TV signal, one's level of TV signal quality, purely cross-sectionally in 1987, and prior, important precursor work like, Ben Olkin's 2009 paper on social capital in Indonesia in response to radio, as well as David Yanagisawa-Drott's, job market paper on the Rwandan genocide, also looking at radio access. I think these papers, these important precursor papers, have made plausible arguments that simply this cross-sectional variation driven by irregular terrain between localities and transmitters can be supported in an argument for in a causal identification setting. But we're going beyond relying just on this cross-sectional variation. So in our diff and diff context, we're also taking advantage of overtime variation in TV signal. So we'll get, as well as overtime variation in all of our outcome variables. So the other, in other words, in this diff and diff context, the other difference is going to be overtime variation from before to after the treatment. And in particular, we'll be arguing that during the rapid transmitter rollout of the 1980s, the exact timing of your transmitter arrival before or after the start of the show in '87 is plausibly exogenous. And we'll be, in our panel data context, we can actually look at pre-trends to document that there don't seem to be any worrying pre-trends. No effects, for example, from anticipating having the show or other policy initiatives that may have been timed to coincide with the show. So that's broadly, what we'll be doing in this, the approach we'll be taking empirically in this paper. All right. So let me give you a preview of our overall results before diving into the details. So first, we find that the show had substantial impacts on identity or cultural outcomes, or we find that greater exposure to the show via having stronger TV signal in 1987 is associated with, and in fact causes, increased use of traditional Hindu names. And secondly, greater adherence to Orthodox Hindu dietary practices, in particular, specifically vegetarianism. We also find important social effects on social outcomes. There's a short-term increase in Hindu-Muslim conflict, the occurrence of any sort of violent act between Hindus and Muslims. And some new results, we find an increase in in-migration. And finally, sort of like the cherry on the ice cream sundae or the icing on the cake, the political outcomes. We find a long-term and quite persistent increase in the electoral success of the main Hindu nationalistic party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, which is as most of you probably know, is the current ruling party of India. So we link these different outcomes in a conceptual causal chain that I'll be returning to in the course of this talk. This is not the only set of arrows that one could draw between these different boxes, but it's the one that we'll emphasize and the one that sort of we think best represents the chain of causation that we think is going on and that links our different analyses. So we find that exposure to Ramayana, measured by TV signal strength in 1987, leads to strengthened Hindu identity as measured by names given to Hindu male babies, as well as vegetarianism. This strengthened Hindu identity has downstream effects. First of all, it probably increases the salience of religious differences in localities, leading to increased Hindu-Muslim conflict. Secondly, it probably increases the appeal of Hindu nationalistic politics, explaining the improved electoral performance of the BJP in state assembly elections that we find.
Can I ask a question here?
Yes, go ahead. Next.
So you start with exposure to Ramayana. Why it's not just exposure to TV? How do we know it's not access to other things that could be on TV?
Excellent question. I think this is one of the most important interpretive issues that we need to address in this paper. I'll come back to that. But let me just say, I'll be addressing that from two different angles. One is to show from other data the overwhelming popularity of this show versus other shows that were on TV, not just in 87, but over the entire 2-decade period spanning 1987. And then to address other events, for example, that may have been on the TV news, in particular, a phenomenon that I'll explain further, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, which is well, I'll come back to that later. We look at, we separately include in the regression as a robustness test, proximity to mobilizing events behind that movement. And we find that those don't affect our coefficient estimates. So, it's as in all papers of this sort, we don't have an RCT here. We have actual natural variation in the real world. It's a natural experiment, not an RCT. I think we feel that we've made the case that it's almost certainly the Ramayana TV show that's causing this, and not anything else that might have been on TV at the same time. But tell us what you think about the evidence that we share on that front. Okay.
Dean, can I also ask?
Yes.
So I think this TV show also in some ways flattened the interpretation of Ramayana a bit. There might be heterogeneous ways you should think about the story, and I think the way it has been, people have been brought up with that story, and it's also flattening that a bit. So how should we think about that in terms of the effects?
What do you mean by flattened? I have a guess as to what you might mean, but let me say a bit more.
Sure. So there is like a part of the story where someone says that like Lakshman did not sleep or his wife did not sleep, And in some parts of India, it's another interpretation of that story. I mean, broadly, it's the same thing, but parts of it are different. And then the TV is coming up and showing one interpretation of the entire story.
Mhm.
So would that challenge for some people how it's being shown and across castes or regions?
The show certainly, if you uh, it was a long running TV show over 78 episodes over 1.5 years, but still it had to make certain choices. The creator and the writers had to make certain choices as to what parts of the epic to leave out because you couldn't include everything. There were thousands of pages in the epic, and you couldn't include everything in 78 episodes. Um, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to. We're not going to say much really in the end about the impact of very specific content within the show. All we try to say in the paper is that exposure to the show has certain cultural, social, and political impacts. I think it's probably beyond our scope to say what it was exactly, what specific content within the show did that. There's a lot of really interesting commentary about how the show, but it's sort of beyond the scope of this paper, about how the show departed from certain or not just I don't not necessarily departed, but sort of chose to focus on certain episodes and not others. Um, very prominent in the discussion is Sita's trial to determine to prove her purity after being kidnapped is not included in the show, and there's a lot of commentary about the importance of that in women's empowerment in India in the last 40 years. Um, but that's beyond sort of anything that we can really say, given the tools that we have. Okay. Um, so with this as our causal chain, I want to sort of highlight that we want to come back to thinking about um, some feedback effects, which are very important for thinking about the long run persistence of a lot of our results. So the impacts on Hindu identity and the impacts on BJP electoral performance are actually quite long run and persistent. Not so much the increased Hindu-Muslim conflict, but the identity outcomes and the BJP performance are actually quite long lasting, at least 10 years after the end of the show. And I think a big question that our results raise is, this was only a 1.5 year show. How could it have had effects that spanned a decade or more afterwards? So there, we think it's very important to think about potential feedback effects. One direction that we're going is to think about the extent to which policies may have been implemented at the local level that could have further stimulated strengthening, or at least maintained the strengthening of Hindu religious identity. Once you get sort of policies implemented that are pro-Hindu or that enhance Hindu identity, then you can start to think about feedback effects that lead to long-run persistence of the initial exposure to Ramayana. In other words, that exposure to Ramayana no longer needs to be thought of as a causal factor after a certain time period. You can just think about the eventual policies that end up being implemented as providing the, maintaining or further strengthening the Hindu identity that leads to all the different effects in the causal chain. Um, uh, Indrajit has a question. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sorry, more of a comment really. It's a follow
Sorry, having
from.
trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Very
Better?
softly, but we'll try.
Can you hear me now? Is it better?
It's still very soft, but I can hear you.
Okay, I'll shout. It's a follow up from Max's question. Uh, uh, I I say there are not many Indians here, but I just want to say that the very first arrow is uh, somewhat questionable. Max said, is it the television itself? Because exposure to Ramayana was there for hundreds, millions of years. And we had other form of shows, like kind of operatic shows that tells us Ramayana story. And,
Right,
very remote villages also are exposed through this sort of shows. So is it the television that Max also asked?
right. No, thank you, Indrajit. Uh, if in case folks couldn't hear the question was what do we mean by this first box here, exposure to Ramayana? Indrajit is making the valid point that the epic has, first of all, been around for 2,500 years. It's one of the key, foundational texts of Hinduism, alongside the Mahabharata. And the Ramayana in particular has been the subject of a sort of very, very long-running and widespread theatrical tradition, referred to as Ramlila, and other presentations as well of the but Ramlila perhaps being the most prominent. We're making it, I think we should make this box more clear. What we mean here is exposure to the Ramayana TV show, and not general exposure to the stories of the Ramayana. I think the word Ramayana is typically, the TV show is explicitly called Ramayana, and so what we're measuring is exposure to the show when it initiated in 1987, and not general exposure to the Ramayana epic. So it's exposure to the story of the Ramayana as told through the particular presentation via TV. So let's just be clear about that. And of course, we can't measure. There's no such data knowing whether any individual locality was actually exposed to the show itself in terms of viewership numbers. So we have to use TV signal in 1987 as a proxy for local viewership. And that leads to the very important interpretation questions that you and Max are raising. Does that make sense? Okay. We were talking about potential sources of feedback loops. One is sort of implementation of pro-Hindu policies at the local level, which are not in the paper yet, but I'm just sort of highlighting this as a direction that this paper, we're still going with this paper. We're incorporating data on schools, for example, and in particular schools founded by the RSS, which is a sort of Hindu nationalist organization. Those types of local level policies could be the types of things that lead to long run persistence of the impacts via some sort of feedback loop. Another type of feedback loop, which we have been able to incorporate in the paper newly, and I'll share with you today, is increased in-migration. So strengthen Hindu identity, and in particular in a local area, and perhaps also improve BJP electoral performance, may lead to in-migration of like-minded individuals, people who are attracted to strengthened local Hindu identity as a local amenity, perhaps. That could lead to persistence of some of these effects, in particular the sort of improved BJP electoral performance down the line. So I'll come back to talking about the extent to which some of the effects could be fully explained by changes in migration. In fact, some of the effects can. Other effects are a bit more sort of hard to explain via just in-migration, but we think that sort of in-migration could be contributing to part of the long-run effects. So a brief word about where our work contributes most importantly to the existing literature. We think our paper should be thought of as making its most important contribution in thinking about how religious entertainment, a religious TV show, can strengthen religious identity and subsequently affect social and political outcomes. And in particular, I think our paper is best thought of as providing the first empirical support for some relatively new and important political economy models of social identification. In particular, Moses Shayo's work, Sambadisan Shayo 2013, and Besley and Persson more recently in 2021. In these theoretical political economy models, key features are that, first of all, social identity is taken to be endogenous rather than exogenous. It's sort of not a fixed characteristic of localities or societies, but something that is malleable and endogenous to circumstances. And in particular, where there's the possibility of multiple equilibria based on initial conditions. So if you start with a condition where social identification is relatively weak and people tend to identify, say, with sort of, the national unit rather than their specific ethnic or religious unit within the polity, then you can get very different equilibria. You can be in sort of an equilibrium that is not actually very ethnically focused and not very identity focused, or you can be in other equilibria that are very focused on ethnic or subnational subgroup identity. these models also have a prominent feature that even temporary shocks to social identity can have persistent effects, precisely because you can end up shifting societies from one political equilibrium to another. And that's very much we like referring to these models in the context of our paper precisely because we think we have one of these types of situations that these models envision, a temporary shock to social identification that can nevertheless have long-run persistent effects by shifting societies towards other political equilibria that are more oriented around identity-based politics. So that's I think the most important way in which we should be thinking about our paper's contribution to the literature. We also, of course, contribute to to literatures on understanding the roots of Hindu nationalism, as well as much larger literature on the the broad effects of mass media on social and political outcomes. We think I think the core contribution of our paper is not so much to showing that mass media can have various types of effects, because that's quite a crowded literature. We think it's more important to think about our paper as showing what can happen when you have an exogenous shock to, in particular, religious identification within a society or within a locality, and understanding its long-run, potentially persistent effects, even if the initial shock is temporary in nature. The shock happens to be delivered by mass media, by TV, but we think we're probably, understanding the impact of TV or mass media more broadly is sort of not the most important literature to which we contribute, because that's, it's a bit more of a crowded and well-populated literature. Okay, so let's dive into some of the specific context of the work. One very important contextual thing is to understand, where the Ramayan treatment occurred in the history of TV access in India. So this graph is one that did not exist before we did all the data work and wrote our paper, because it's based on one of our key data contributions, which is a panel data set of TV transmitter rollout in India over this time period. So using I'll say a bit more about this, but after once we assemble our data and use our irregular terrain model to calculate TV signal across the map of India, for the first time we can actually estimate provide estimates of the share of the Indian population with minimum TV coverage. In other words, enough TV signal to watch TV. And this is just based on a threshold used by broadcasters. And that share of the Indian population with minimal TV signal to watch TV, rises over time. It doesn't rise very fast in the 1970s. A key event was 1982 when Delhi hosted the Asian Games. Not only about 20% of the Indian population, had enough TV signal to watch TV and thus to watch the Asian Games, but that led to a realization that there was a much higher incipient demand for TV than currently had access to it. That led the national TV broadcaster Doordarshan to initiate a period of very rapid transmitter rollout. So basically between 1984 and 1990, you see this dramatic rise where the share of the Indian population with enough TV signal to watch TV went from below 30% to close to 80% in just a few years. Ramayan happens in the middle of it, at a point where about 62% of the Indian population had sufficient TV signal to watch TV. And so we would argue that during this this period of rapid rollout, it was somewhat arbitrary whether you got sufficient TV signal in time to watch Ramayan or not, and will be basically going to be that's going to underlie our argument that there's it's plausibly exogenous what your level of TV signal quality was in the beginning of 1987 when the show emerged. This is let me start off actually before showing you this animation, just showing you the exact variation we use as our treatment variable. So on the left-hand side here, we have a map of India at the pixel level, showing TV signal quality at the pixel level. Dark blue is higher quality. Red dots are transmitters. This is the sort of basic pixel level data that represents, at a very, very fine-grained level, the level of TV signal quality in 1987. We don't do our analyses at the pixel level. We have to do all of our analyses at the level of 4,000 assembly constituencies, which you see on the right-hand side here. And so basically, the assembly constituency level measures of TV signal quality are simply population-weighted averages across pixels within each assembly constituency. And again, there are 4,000 of these. And this is the level at which we're going to be doing most of our empirical analyses. Indrajit, go ahead.
A comment and a question. Question first. Do you by any chance have any data on the number of TV sets owned by population? That is, how many families roughly had TV
Great
sets?
question. Thank you for raising that.
That's my question. My comment is, as I'm sure you are aware, in those days when I was a teenager, football perhaps was not even born, Ramayana was a kind of communal event. People used to gather in a household who owned a TV set, and
Right.
50, 100 people would
Yeah.
sit down in front of the telly for Ramayana. So it's a chicken and egg thing. So people started watching because Ramayana was telecast.
Well, that's absolutely right. And so basically, there isn't very good data on TV set ownership across India. We should probably do a better job and share in the paper existing numbers. So that's a very useful comment. But the broad qualitative situation is, as you say, TV set ownership was relatively low. And one illustration was the picture that I shared with you at the very beginning, showing a number of sort of people in a village crowding around the one TV where they're all watching the show. So I think you're absolutely right, and I think we emphasize this. The communal aspect of the experience probably, I mean, we can't say this for sure because it's hard to test empirically, but it probably was something that enhanced the communal aspect and perhaps the religious aspect of the show. People could see, there must have been, my gut feeling is that there must have been some reinforcement of the effects from watching the show in a group, in a communal setting, and from seeing others experiencing the show in certain religious ways. Okay, so I just showed you, the 1987 signal that I'm showing here is exactly the variation that we're using as our measure of treatment. But in addition to just collecting data on TV signal in 1987, we also collected, we estimated TV signal at the pixel level and thus at the assembly constituency level in every year of our data. And you can see how those data change from as we march from one year to the next in this animation. And why do we do that? First, the most important thing we do here is separately estimate the impact of having TV in general on the outcomes that we're interested in. So this involves a very simple panel analysis where we include contemporaneous TV signal on the right-hand side to estimate its impacts. Separately from the diff and diff estimate of the impact of TV access in 1987, which only kicks in 1987. So I'll show you the regression equations shortly, but the most important thing we do here with this time varying measure of TV signal at the local level is to separate the impact of having TV signal in 1987 from the general impact of having TV on all of our outcome variables. That's the most important reason that we put in so much effort to get this time series of TV signal across all of our localities. Having this time series also allows us to do things like robustness tests, like if we just limit our sample to places that got TV in a fairly narrow window, say from 1984 to 91. If we just sort of drop places that got, like Delhi and the other big cities that got TV very early from the analysis, or dropping places that are very, very isolated and got TV very late, our results are almost completely robust to just limiting our sort of analysis to a very narrow window, a much narrower window of localities that got TV around the same time, where it's probably more plausible to say that the exact timing of when you got TV in that narrow window is more exogenous than just looking at the overall variation across 20 years. Okay, so that's the TV signal rollout. Let me say a brief word about the Ramayan TV show. There are a lot of people here who know the show intimately, experienced it in real time, but for others, let me give a bit of background. So the show is a serialization of the Sanskrit epic Ramayana, which is 2,500 years old. Apurv raised a question about how the show departs from the original narrative, but for the most part, it is quite true to the overall arc of the narrative. Broadly, it tells the story of the life of Ram, who is an avatar of the Hindu deity Vishnu. He tells about his birth, his upbringing, the point at which he is about to ascend to the throne, but at which point, because of palace intrigue, he is exiled for 14 years to the forest with his brother Lakshman and his wife Sita. They have many years of adventures in the forest. Sita, one of the most dramatic and important events is that Sita is kidnapped by the demon king Ravan and brought to Lanka, and there's a subsequent war to rescue her. The war, eventually Ram and his allies rescue Sita and eventually return to Ayodhya to rule at the start of an era of peace and prosperity. So it's a very sort of, said in this way, it's something one might imagine would be compelling to put on screen for entertainment purposes, but it turns out that, in a way that was unexpected to the broadcaster, it also had very strong religious impact that we're studying, and that's been documented qualitatively by many other scholars. So the show was a groundbreaking production for the time. It had sort of, up to the, it's sort of special effects, costumes, and music were very much on the technological frontier of the time. So it succeeded on that front. Just some specifics about the broadcast. So these are the dates that it was broadcast for 1.5 years in 1987 and 88. As I mentioned before, it was aired by the state broadcaster under a Congress government, Rajiv Gandhi's government. It's not true that there was completely no anticipation of the potential political impacts, because there was some debate actually within Rajiv Gandhi's government as to whether the show would have political impacts or what they would be. But they were sufficient. I think it's fair to say that these anticipated impacts were sufficiently uncertain that in the end, the desire to boost advertising revenue won out. So the original predictions that the show would boost advertising revenue were correct, but they were correct beyond the wildest dreams of the creator and the broadcaster. Ended up bringing in much more advertising revenue than expected and being much more popular than expected. And as I've mentioned before, the sort of the political and social impacts were also anticipated. A brief word about about how popular Ramayan was based on other data. One of the, as we've discussed, we don't have a measure of Ramayan viewership. We have a measure of TV signal at the beginning of 1987 when Ramayan first aired. There's no such thing as Nielsen data from this time in India. So the best thing we could think of to determine whether in fact people were likely to be watching Ramayan was mentions in India's main newspaper, the Times of India. So we scraped data on articles in the Times of India between 1980 and 2000, and we actually looked for mentions of every TV show that was aired on Doordarshan during this 20-year time period. And we're graphing here the number of mentions of each TV show in the year it was released and the year after. We're not showing a long tail of shows that were never mentioned at all, where the number of mentions was 0. And you can see here that the most dramatic thing in this graph is that Ramayan is by far the most widely mentioned show in the Times of India in its year of release and the year after. 286 mentions. No other show comes close. The closest shows are only about half that level, and most shows getting nowhere near. Nothing even close to half the number of mentions of Ramayan. So it's this graph that we use to make the point that even though we don't know what exactly people were watching in 1987, without a doubt they were watching Ramayan a lot, and there's no indication that any other show comes close. Not only in 1987 for that matter, but over the entire 20-year period spanning Ramayan's release. All right, so this is going to be what we refer to when we basically say it's very unlikely that there was anything else on TV in 1987 that is causing the effects that we document, even though sort of we're not measuring watching Ramayan directly, we're measuring TV signal at the beginning of 1987.
Can I
Yes, Max.
post one idea or question? I was thinking about what would be the parallel thing maybe in other countries, just to have some kind of sense, and sporting event came to my mind. So when you have a big sporting event, the country is doing very well, maybe in the World Cup in other countries, that could have sort of galvanized, and it also has a nationalistic flavor to it. And in early days of TV, that could spark some kind of investment in I remember from my country communal watching and buying TV sets and things like that. So here in this picture, do you include things that are, or how can you include mentioning of a sporting event? Maybe that is
That's a good
slightly
point.
different and therefore wouldn't be necessarily
Yeah,
included in that measure, but
yeah.
on a field basis, it feels like it could have a similar role in galvanizing sort of
Right. No,
nationalistic
that's a good point.
fever.
And there has been prior work, showing the importance of like winning in soccer, for example, for sort of feelings of sort of national identification. So no, that's a great idea. We should look at that. We don't have data on sporting events at the moment, but that shouldn't be something that shouldn't be too hard to incorporate. Certainly we want to see what was going on in the cricket world during that time period. No, very good. Thank you for that thought. Um, Okay, so just looking at the time here, I need to speed up a little bit, but I do need to say a brief word about the BJP for those of you not familiar with sort of the Indian context. Leading up to just before the airing of Ramayan, we're showing the sort of which political party held the state assembly seat in the last election in 1986 or before, right before Ramayan's airing. The Indian National Congress, the Congress party is in blue, the dominant political party at the time, and since independence. The BJP is in orange, and prior to Ramayan, the BJP only holds 186 out of 4,000 assembly constituencies. The BJP was founded in 1980, and if you had to summarize its platform in one sentence, it promotes the vision of India as a Hindu nation, often referred to as Hindutva. It had limited success in the 1980s. It only had 2 seats in the national parliament, and as we show here, only 186 state assembly seats out of 4,000. After Ramayan, so this is graphing, a very similar graph, but for the first election in 1989 or after, all of a sudden there's a lot more orange on the map. So now the BJP is holding 584 seats out of 4,000. So from a time series standpoint, and the information in these two graphs is what's behind a lot of the cultural and sort of general news commentary that Ramayan may have had something, the show may have had something to do with the rise of the BJP. Just from a time series standpoint, there's much more BJP political success afterwards than before. So what we're doing in this work is going beyond just the simple time series comparison and looking to see whether the improvement in the BJP's political fortunes happens to also have been in places that had better TV signal in 1987, thus could have been exposed to the Ramayan TV show. All right, so in the interest of time, I'll let you read the paper if you want to look at all of our different data sources. We have, in particular, I think the names data is quite amazing. It's from electoral rolls. We're not the only ones to have used these data. We're building on the work of others, and we much appreciate, the work of others who have found creative ways to use these electoral roll data. Our biggest data contribution, like I said, is the creation of a time series of TV transmitter rollout in India, which we can use to create the time series of TV signal at the pixel level and at the assembly constituency level that I showed you earlier. This is a huge data enterprise. It took 50 days of computing time on the University of Michigan's high capacity computing cluster. But we think it was worth it. We hope you think it was worth it as well. We're building on the work of others who use irregular terrain models to take advantage of irregularities in terrain to come up with plausibly exogenous cross-sectional variation in TV signal. It's very important to even though we're looking at the actual signal that accounts for terrain, it's also very important to control for what's known as free space or unobstructed signal, which is simply a measure of proximity to transmitters. And, make sure that we're not identifying any effects from mere proximity to transmitters, which is clearly not exogenous, not the basis of, not done arbitrarily, but done actually quite intentionally. And transmitters are placed in sort of more urbanized, more commercially places with more commercial potential. But on top, so even though if we think there's an argument that cross-sectionally, as long as you control for free space signal, that sort of like one's actual TV signal is exogenous, we're going beyond just pure cross-sectional variation, and we're exploiting the panel dimension of our data as well. So as I mentioned earlier, in our diff and diff strategy, we're taking advantage of not only cross-sectional variation, which is due to irregular terrain, but also time series variation, from before to after TV, from before to after Ramayan airing in 1987. We're taking advantage of arbitrariness in TV transmitter rollout timing, arguing that sort of whether you actually got good quality TV signal in 1987 was somewhat arbitrarily determined by the broadcaster's rollout schedule. Key controls to make sure that that's plausible are state year fixed effects. We'll only be taking advantage of variation within Indian states and not sort of comparing sort of localities that are very far from one another. We also, if you're worried about other potential violations of parallel trends, we have baseline locality characteristics. A broad set of them interacted with all year fixed effects. So I've just mentioned parallel trends. That is the key identification assumption in this diff and diff setting. And to state it plainly, in the absence of Ramayan, changes in outcome variables would not have systematically differed across areas with different levels of TV signal strength in 1987. So that's, this is standard in diff and diff analyses. Here's our regression equation. We'll be looking at outcomes like, in the end, the dummy variable for the BJP winning the local assembly seat in a particular year. We'll be regressing that, and on the key right-hand side variable of interest, Ramayan, which is simply signal strength in 1987, your exposure to the Ramayan TV show, which is how we're interpreting that, times post, which is a dummy for 1987 and after. So this is, it's very much, typical diff and diff setup with one treatment that varies in its intensity, happening at one time, 1987, but which may have persistent effects afterwards. We're normalizing this variable, so the beta 1 captures a 1 standard deviation impact. We've got location I fixed effects. We do better than just year fixed effects by estimating state year fixed effects. And again, we have a vector of baseline or fixed characteristics of localities interacted with all year effects. So this is the basic regression setup. Let me share all of our results with you in the time we have remaining. So again, we're going to be coming back to this causal chain. So first we'll be looking at the impact of exposure to Ramayan on markers of Hindu identity. And the first thing we look at is the share of Hindu male newborns given common Hindu names. And this is simply whether your name is in the historical top 10 for your state. So we look at Hindu males only for reasons specific to our names data that I won't go into right now. And we basically, for every Indian state, we look at names given to males in a prior historical period, in particular 1900 to 1970, well before our data. And we identify the top 10 names. So it's as simple as that, given to Hindu males. And then we look during our period of analysis at the probability that a newborn male is given one of those top 10 Hindu names, those historically top 10 Hindu names for your state. We don't find any pre-trend, first of all, in the period. This is in this event study diagram. We don't find any pre-trend. There's no effect prior to the Ramayan show being aired, and then in the precise time period where the show is aired, we see an uptick and a continued not just a stability of a positive coefficient, but in fact a coefficient that grows in magnitude over time. So this is one of the sort of key outcomes that I referred to earlier that shows strong persistence and in fact the magnification of the effect size over time, which is really why we try to think about the possibility of potential feedback effects that could sort of like not, should not just extend, but even potentially reinforce the original impact of the Ramayan show.
Dean,
This,
can I ask?
yes, Upward.
So one way of my interpretation of this result was that a lot of Bollywood new heroes, they also came up with common names so that they can be easily pronounced and remembered. So in some ways, this result can be seen as you want your child to go on TV and be a celebrity. So you're trying to aim to be a celebrity and not being Hindu in some ways.
Interesting. Well, we're certainly not measuring religiosity per se. We're not imposing any sort of like, assessment of the religiosity behind the name. We're simply saying, is this a common name for Hindu males
Hmm.
in your area in sort of, the 7 prior decades from 1900 to 1970? So interpret this how you will. I think that if you doubt that this truly would be motivated by religious or religious interest or religiosity, we have a second outcome variable, which is vegetarianism. We can't show an event study here because this variable is only available in 2 time periods, 1982 and 1999. It's from the Iris Reds data set. But what we can show here, using a similar regression setup with just the 2 time periods, is that exposure to Ramayan does lead to an increase in vegetarianism, and that increase is concentrated among lower caste Hindus. It's a large effect. 1 standard deviation increase in TV signal leads to 14 percentage point increase from a base of 38%. There's no effect for upper caste Hindus, whose general rate of vegetarianism is about 50%. This can be viewed as an instance of the phenomenon of Sanskritization, which has been, documented for many decades in India, the adoption of upper caste practices by lower caste Hindus. Thank you to Abhijit Banerjee, who suggested that we frame these results, in this context. And so, yeah, I think so. This is one way of, again, this is a large effect. This 1 standard deviation increase in TV signal closes the gap entirely in vegetarianism between lower and upper caste Hindus. So that's the other cultural outcome. We have names and we have vegetarianism. What are some downstream effects? First we look at Hindu-Muslim conflict. Here's the event study for that outcome. The outcome variable here is a dummy variable for whether there was any conflict between Hindus and Muslims that led to an injury or a death. This is from the very nice Varshney Wilkinson data set, which we are very happy to have been able to use. And this is the effect is only short run here. It shows up in particular in 1991-92 and sort of goes away after that. There's no evidence of a troubling pre-trend here either. So this is our first sort of social outcome. It's a short run increase in Hindu-Muslim conflict. Finally, we turn to looking at the BJP's political performance, which may be due to increased appeal of Hindu nationalistic politics when Hindu identity is strengthened. Here's the event study for that outcome. The outcome variable here is an indicator for whether the BJP won an assembly constituency election that was held in that time period. And here it's a bit more noisy in the pre-period, but it's quite clear that there's an ongoing upward trend that may, if anything, be magnified over time. And again, sort of no evidence of a troubling pre-trend. This is a large effect. The mean effect is, in the entire. If you take the mean effect in the entire period, that's about a 24% increase in the probability that the BJP wins the election, resulting from a 1 standard deviation increase in TV signal quality. So that's that's the full set of our empirical results. We spent a lot of time worrying about a variety of emitted variables, some of which we've discussed already, but let me just review again what kind of emitted variable concerns we might have. The first was generally whether it's the effect of Ramayan exposure in 1987 versus just having TV in general. That's a very important interpretation concern, and that motivated our huge investment in generating TV signal measures at the locality level for every year of our data. The way we assess this is simply to include current and lag TV signal in the regression and see how it affects our coefficients on the effect of Ramayan. If what we're capturing is really just the effect of TV signal in general and not Ramayan exposure in 1987, then we should see an attenuation of our treatment effect estimates. And in fact, we don't see that. We see our effects are completely robust to controlling for current and lag TV signal. A narrower question. If you're convinced that really the effects are about having TV signal in 1987, then you may reasonably ask, as Max asked earlier, was it perhaps something else on TV in 1987? That's harder to get at, but we think that's highly unlikely, given the data that we showed you earlier, that no other TV show comes near to the number of times of India mentions, which is our proxy for viewership, or at least cultural reach and cultural impact compared to Ramayan. Finally, a bit more, a very important issue, but that those of you who don't, if anyone who doesn't study Indian political economy may not be as familiar with, potential confounding by a movement known as the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. This was a Hindu national campaign to build a temple dedicated to Ram, so the same central character of the Ramayana and the Ramayan TV show. The key mobilizing event in this movement was a traveling rally held in late 1990 known as the Ram Rath Yatra. This eventually culminated in the demolition of the Babri Mosque by Hindu activists in December 1992. The broad concern here is potential confounding of the effect of Ramayan with any possible coincidence in proximity to the Ram Rath Yatra route, which is the main mobilizing event behind the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. We show in the paper that when we include in the regression measures of proximity to the Ram Rath Yatra route interacted with a post-1990 dummy, which is basically thinking about the Ram Rath Yatra as a treatment alongside the Ramayan treatment, we show that our Ramayan coefficients are barely changed when we include this measure of proximity to the Ram Rath Yatra, which is a sort of the key mobilizing event behind the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. So it doesn't look like that very important action by that very important movement behind which the BJP was very much the active force doesn't seem to be confounding our estimates of the effect of Ramayan. Okay, so to close, I want to come back to the idea of feedback loops and basically say, now that you've seen our results in detail, it's quite clear that certain key impacts, the cultural outcomes, the names and the vegetarianism, as well as the impacts on BJP electoral performance are quite long lasting. And it's really important to explain how a short, a TV show that had a short run of 1.5 years could have effects that extend over an entire decade afterwards. And one, that makes us think about possible mechanisms through which there may be feedback loops. Pro-Hindu policies implemented at the local level may be one explanation for potential feedback loops that could lead to, eventual, continued strengthening of Hindu identity even after the show has gone away. And that could explain persistence of some of the key outcomes, in particular, well, the cultural outcomes, Hindu identity outcomes, as well as the improved BJP electoral performance. We're still working on these outcomes. We're assembling schools data, in particular schools run by the RSS, which is a Hindu nationalist organization that's allied with the BJP. That could potentially, we think, help explain some of the continued persistence of strengthened Hindu identity. Another thing that we can show and that we just were able to put together recently was impacts on in-migration. And I can show you an event study here. This is based on very different data. This is based on Indian census data, which is decennial every 10 years. And we're looking at here at a measure of the share of individuals in a district. And now we're doing this analysis at the level of Indian districts rather than the much smaller assembly constituencies. So we have some losses in power. We have larger standard errors. But it does look like there's a positive effect on the share of the population that was born in a different district. So, there's a positive impact on in-migration from having been exposed to the Ramayan TV show. We think this is quite striking. It's not an effect that we expected to find, but many people asked us about migration impacts, and so we thought it was important to look at this. It does suggest, I think that that perhaps the strengthened Hindu identity in localities was a positive amenity to some categories of migrants, perhaps those who shared who similarly placed value on having the strengthened Hindu identity. The Let me just say really briefly here. We think the effects on vegetarianism and the effects on BJP electoral performance are too large to be fully explained by simply these changes in migration. So only these in migration could explain a portion of those effects, but only a minority. Whereas the effect on Hindu naming, frankly, I didn't talk about the magnitudes, is relatively small, and so the effect on Hindu names could be fully explained by this the level of this increase, the magnitude of this increase in migration. All right, so I've covered everything. I think rather than just sort of repeating myself, I'll close at this point and happy to take any further questions if folks have any.
Thank you, Dean. I think it's the hour, so I'll stop the recording. And